In a new interview, the former acting Secretary of Defense is says blame for the January 6th Capitol riot is on the former President of the United States, Donald Trump. This is really the first time that we've heard from Chris Miller since the insurrection. He was the acting Defense Secretary at the time, the man not only in charge of America's military, but also the man who had final approval on sending in the National Guard to stop the violence on that day, to send in reinforcements. Well, here he is speaking to Vice.
Do you think the president was responsible for what happened on the 6th?
I don't know, but it seems cause and effect, yeah. The question is, would anybody have marched on the Capitol and overrun the Capitol without the president's speech? I think it's pretty much definitive that wouldn't have happened. So, yes.
Joining me right now is the former Deputy FBI Director, Andy McCabe. So, Andy, what did you think when you heard Miller lay the blame at Trump's feet? I mean, did this surprise you?
Well, it did, Kate. You know, it's always extraordinary when you hear someone who was that closely intertwined with the previous administration to come out and call out what many of us could see in plain sight. So I think it is surprising and significant that former acting Defense Secretary Miller is being that clear about the fact that it was Trump's words that caused the riot. However, I will say that later in the interview, he kind of hedges his bets a little bit by floating the idea that, well, it's not clear that Trump knew what he was doing or knew that his words would have that effect on the crowd, which I find to be much less believable.
Yeah, considering everyone said that his words were going to create violence and cause violence for months ahead of time. You know, Miller also said that he did not speak to Donald Trump on the day of the insurrection, as this was all happening or even after. The Secretary of Defense did not speak to the Commander-in-Chief on the day that the seat of American democracy was being violently attacked. I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but did you find that surprising?
Well, it is. It's ridiculous. The day the Capitol gets sacked, the Secretary of Defense has no communication with the president. However, he did, when he answered that question, the question was, did you speak to the president or anyone else in the White House during the attack? And he said, I didn't speak to the president. So I think it's still an open question as to whether or not he did make contact to maybe the president's chief of staff or other White House personnel. But still, that call should have been to the commander-in-chief, and it should have been to figure out how they were going to repel that attack. And clearly that didn't happen.
And just to remind folks, I mean, Miller has been criticized for potentially slow-walking approval in critical time period about sending in the National Guard. The head of the National Guard, you and I were on together and talked about this. He raised this question while testifying before Congress when we learned that approval to send in the Guard, where Chris Miller is the final approver, took more than 3 hours. I want to play for you how Chris Miller responded to that in this interview.
It comes back to understanding how the military works. This isn't a video game. It's not Halo. It's not, you know, Black Ops, call to duty.
It's also not 3 hours and 19 minutes. I mean, does this answer this key question stemming from what were the failures exposed on January 6th?
It does not. And look, no one was asking Chris Miller whether or not he thought the events that took place on January 6th were out of a video game. The fact is, his folks, his staff, were on that joint call with the Metropolitan Police Department, Capitol Police, and the D.C. Guard, in which they pushed back on the request for reinforcements and allegedly because they didn't like the optics of it. His Defense Department also withdrew the authorization that the D.C. Guard normally has prior to the event to be able to deploy assets when during a crisis and to move folks around. So there was clear obstruction here on the part of the Defense Department. He is responsible for the Defense Department. So I think, we have a lot more questions that we need to get answers to.
I was actually going to ask you that because I've heard senators tell me that they want Chris Miller as one of the people who they want to have testify after this interview. I mean, there clearly are more questions to be asked.
That's absolutely right. And testimony in Congress is good. It gives us some idea of what happened, but we're not going to know this until we have a real investigation.
Yeah, and testifying before Congress, as much as we say you can't lie to the press, well, you definitely shouldn't and can't lie to Congress when you're under oath. It's good to see you, Andy. Thank you very much.